Hey, happy Friday. In a development that would make teenage me very happy and is making adult me very happy, you may have noticed that there have been a decent amount of releases in January that are dealing with the idea of fairies and the fae, and I have definitely been keeping my eye on them for sure. And amidst some anticipated releases from giants within the fairy realm, like Holly Black, we have a start of a new series, I realized upon reading Emily Wilde's Encyclopaedia of Faeries by Heather Fawcett. This has been picking up some traction the last couple of weeks since it came out, I've noticed, and I think it definitely hit at the right moment because one, fairies are so popular, but two, it is kind of straddling that line between cozy fantasies, which have grown exponentially in popularity in the last year especially, and our more traditional kind of tales of the fae, and that bleeding of like your more toned down, gentle fairy tales, your Cottonly Fairies ilk, versus the kind of harder view of fairies and the seelie versus the unseelie courts, and the kind of capriciousness of the fae, which has really been popular since I was a teenager. And that looking at the kind of darker side of everything and really going back to the dark roots of fairy tales. And so this is a little bit more a happy medium that ends up a little bit more on the cozy side, while also setting up a series that can appeal to readers that go in for like mystery series, because here we have a strong duo set up. So if you like series like the Deanna Raybourn, Veronica Speedwell series, I think this will also be of interest, even if the dynamics aren't exactly the same. And excuse me if I've got some frogs in my throat, because I'm having this moment where I realize I don't know if I've talked out loud before this moment today. I had meetings, but I didn't talk in those meetings. Irregardless, this follows Emily Wilde, who is going on this kind of research expedition to this Nordic country. I did not read it as a real Nordic country, but I am also notoriously geographically challenged. So many apologies if it is indeed a real country. However, it felt like a kind of created place and in-between that fits within the liminal spaces explored in the story itself. And she is going to this kind of remote place because it is one of the last unexplored areas for her Encyclopedia of Fairies, where she is kind of drawing a wide swath of fairy lore and knowledge across everywhere, I guess. It doesn't really go into it. And this is what I'm really interested in terms of the series, because I think the idea of her exploration and this encyclopedia is kind of opening doors for us. And yes, if you've read the book, the use of the word door is an intentional word choice in this moment, but I think it offers opportunity to explore fairy lore in a lot of different cultures, and I really do hope that we get to see that wide breadth of fairy lore across cultures, because there is so much lore to dive into. But here we're in this kind of Nordic setting, very snowy, and we're mirroring it a little bit through the lens of kind of the Irish fae and Irish folklore predominantly. And I would argue that that is probably the most recognizable for most readers. And it does draw a distinction between what it calls the tall ones, what we would potentially refer to as kind of unseelie versus seelie courts, at least when fairy lore started to become popular in fiction again, especially in the 2000s. This book sets out to complicate that idea a little bit, or at least it complicates it in a footnote by saying that it recognizes that that distinction doesn't really mean a whole lot, because the fae will trick you whatever opportunity they're given, and the kind of more traditional like brownies and household fae. And I was really fascinated by the idea of the academics of this. I admittedly have gone down some academic wormholes regarding the fae in relation to A Midsummer Night's Dream, because, okay, slight tangent, when I was in college, we did A Midsummer Night's Dream. Me being the nerd that I am and kind of in love with these darker fairy stories that I really gravitated toward as a teen, from like Holly Black, Melissa Marr, Karen Marie Moning, I was very excited when my director told me that they wanted to go kind of darker with the fairies and explore exploring a lot of their powers, including potentially the ability to time travel, this idea that Puck would know more in this world. So I had to start this research, and believe it or not, I went back to a lot of these books as kind of my starting point. I went to them to see if there were any sources they could point me to in order to find this information. So Emily is going to do this research. These are the kinds of things she is interested in, and this is kind of uncharted territory. But when she gets there, she doesn't really know how to integrate herself with the community. She kind of insults them right away by indicating that she doesn't want to be treated like a guest, which just kind of speaks to some differing social norms. And social norms are something that Emily kind of struggles with. There is definitely some implication of neurodivergence within Emily in the text. And I found this really interesting because I think we've been seeing a lot more kind of scholarship and thinking in relation to that and the Fae, which I believe another release that unfortunately is HarperCollins, and hopefully that will be resolved soon because I believe they have agreed to mediation, and we can dive into that book at some later point. I believe that that's something that that book is going to be exploring, that kind of connection. So the book kind of explores the idea that Emily understands the customs and worlds of the Fae better than she understands the customs of her peers in many ways. And she is very singularly focused on these goals and on this scholarship. And this singular focus is somewhat upset by the arrival of her colleague, Wilde Bambleby. And admittedly, when I read the blurb for this, I thought that this was going to be an academic rivals, kind of enemies to lovers situation. Side note that I might go into more, this book I've seen classified as romance a lot in different lists. I personally wouldn't classify it as such. I would argue that, like I said before, it aligns more with like a historical mystery series where there is a romantic subplot or element, but it's not the main driver of the thing. Rather, it is one of the through lines of the series. But I thought that that was going to be a more adversarial relationship. Rather, it's more kind of grudging acceptance and almost friendship in a way, as close as both of these characters really have to friendship. And they both work at the same university, but Bambleby is a little bit more established, and Emily is still working to get permanent placement, tenure, whatever the equivalent is that I may have missed the exactness of. But she's very protective of her research for this reason, and she also suspects that Bambleby's knowledge of the Fae may be a little bit more personal than academic. And this is a suspicion that is established very early in the book so that we as readers are looking for these clues and are expecting a payoff on that suspicion. And so over the course of her research, she stumbles upon lesser Fae, discovers a changeling, and also uncovers a plot with a fairy king stuck in a tree, all whilst trying to deal with a town that does not like her at first, and the somewhat foppish research companion that finds her charming despite her best efforts sometimes. And the narrative is told through the conceit of this research journal that she is keeping, which admittedly I don't know how I felt about, because I don't think it had these moments of like footnotes and scholarship, but I don't feel like the voice in and of itself felt scholarly enough. It was definitely going for a little bit more elevated and attempting that scholarly, but I think it just used a lot of big words more than anything. But in terms of like the journal itself, if it is being centered around this idea of scholarship, I don't really know the point of the journal. And sure, I haven't been on field studies, so maybe there is something to be said for recording everything that happens, and I definitely understand, especially when we start moving into the more Fae-centric things that happen, making sure those are recorded, but then being able to balance out the personal and professional in it. I don't know that there was enough of that kind of struggle, and there was just something about the voice of it, I think, that just didn't feel like it fell too much one way or the other. And to be fair, I think that that is where a lot of this novel wants to live. It wants to live in the in-between of that, and I definitely think that the voice and the way the story is told is part of what helps keep it on the cozier side, even as, especially toward the end, we really are looking at some of the real malevolence of fairies, and there are happenings, especially at the climax, that I could definitely see very easily in something like Holly Black. These moments where humans are drawn in to these fairy enchantments and how to get out of that. and how to puzzle yourself out of that. And I did really appreciate this idea that Emily's brain gave her the upper hand in a lot of these scenarios. She was able to see the narrative threads and the importance of story to the Fae and these kind of repeating patterns. It really touched on things like the importance of threes and whatnot. And as a reader and someone who seeks out these kinds of stories frequently, I really appreciated the idea that we're looking at what the kind of common threads of these stories are and then using those within the world. And I think that that was also a way to bring that scholarship in and let Emily shine in this arena, especially as it's established that she has firmer footing maneuvering with the Fae. She knows those kind of narrative ins and outs. And I think that where this falls on the coziness spectrum kind of too goes back to where the stakes lay, and especially at the beginning of the book for Emily, a lot of the stakes are rooted to her research and her ultimate goals related to that research. And so there's a little bit of distance there, especially narratively. She's able to kind of look at things like this changeling child terrorizing this mother and father and look at it intellectually, which is also interesting because changelings have really been reevaluated through the modern lens as a way of coding autism in children. And I found that fascinating, especially when I believe as a reader that we're looking at Emily on a similar spectrum. And I think that there were opportunities to layer exploration there that weren't fully mined. However, as she's going about this research, she becomes more integrated with the town. The town becomes of more importance to her. She becomes more accepted as well. And so we've got this element of found family that I think is very prevalent, especially in cozy fantasy. I think cozy fantasy has filled a void for people who may feel a little bit lonelier, and it has a little bit of whimsy while also providing the safety of that found family narrative. And it's her research that ultimately opens up this door for her so she doesn't have to change anything about herself. And all of these kind of interactions are threaded together. So everything kind of builds on each other, and I can definitely see the framework of her like meeting the fairy in the forest, to discovering this tree in a story, to rescuing these two maidens from the village and spiraling down to what becomes the climax. All of those things are connected. However, because of the way the narrative is structured, they also feel a little bit more staccato and separate. Even if I know like the changeling leads to this, leads to that, I know that they're all connected, but they don't necessarily feel connected. And I think that part of that goes back to the tone and the voice of these journal entries and the kind of coziness of the story itself. I think a common critique of cozy fantasy from people is that it can feel a little bit slower, and it may also be a scholarship thing. While the Encyclopaedia offers this kind of broad swath and sets up great series potential, within the book itself, it doesn't feel like she has this great question, a research question that she's really seeking out to answer. And there are questions that pop up that feel like they could be that big question or want to be that big question, but she is not making her choices based on those questions, if that makes sense. She is not being kind of moved forward by that. Rather, she's being moved forward by a kind of all-encompassing curiosity, which is great, but decentralizes things a little bit so that it feels like we're just kind of falling in two different things, which can also work because, as I said, the structure is still clearly there. It just kind of depends what you're looking for. With that as well, Emily and Bamblebee, Wilde, could feel a little flatter at times, but that didn't really bother me because it did make sense within establishing of a series and their character types. We've got the kind of more reserved, studious lead here in Emily, and especially if we're setting this up as a series, it's gonna take some time for her to kind of warm up and pull out of her shell, if she needs to even pull out of any shell. I'm not implying that she does need to, but it's gonna take some time to see the full kind of breadth of her if we are setting up this series properly, ideally. Same for Wilde. We have this very foppish character right now, but with both of them, we know very little ultimately about their backstories. We know the kind of bare bones. Emily, we actually know the least. So there's great potential for discovery and evolution there, and this book is really kind of setting up their archetypes and, more importantly, their dynamic. And I really enjoyed their dynamic. You could almost kind of feel Emily's eye rolls, her sighs, her kind of grudging acceptance turned to affection for Bamblebee, and I think there was some affection even at the beginning, because even from his first kind of introduction through this letter he sent her, I immediately realized that I had clocked the dynamic of this relationship wrong within the blurb. And there's something really fun and charming in it that both can recognize things in the other that the wider world at large doesn't. These quiet moments where we see them just existing together, and the easy kind of acceptance of that. How Emily grounds Wendell a bit more, and how Wendell kind of brings Emily out of her shell a little bit. And he always respects her knowledge and her curiosity while still feeling like a little bit rooted in that kind of Oscar Wilde archetype. So I think that that's a really fun partnership to set up, and I am especially intrigued to see how it's going to grow over the series. And I guess with it being a series, one of my critiques of this book might be that there was almost too much going on, while it still felt a little slower at times, because it didn't feel as driven by this kind of outside force. Especially toward the end of the book, there was a lot that happened very quickly that felt like it didn't get enough time to breathe. And the kind of story type it was exploring was interesting, and I understand why it was going there, but I would have loved time to live in a lot of these adventures more. And I think I understand why we didn't, if we are going to be moving from place to place in each book and kind of setting it up as a mystery of the week, which I also love the idea of. So I both get it and want it a little bit more at the same time. But I think that not getting to kind of like establish some of that more robbed some of the bigger moments of feeling like bigger moments. But again, I think that this is a much different kind of series that it's setting up. And I'm also really excited about that, because it does feel like it's filling a kind of void. It's not like the full kind of supernatural series of the 2000s, but it's also not a full cozy. It's obviously not a historical kind of mystery, but it's got some of those similar partnership dynamics. I'm very intrigued to see how this is going to continue, and I think this is going to resonate with a lot of readers because it's not ignoring the darkness. Like I said, we are playing with some of those darker story types, especially related to the Fae and the Tall Ones, as they're called here. But because of the narrative style, even though we are playing in some of that darkness, it is stripped of a little bit of its danger. And I think this would be interesting if we kind of pushed the academic part of it even a little bit more. I don't want it to read like a JSTOR article by any means, but I think if we engage with that a little bit more intentionally, it may make that feel a little bit more real. And of course we have the footnotes, so it's there, it's on the right track. I just think it could have been pushed even a little further. Also, based on some of the scholarship and the footnotes, one, I read it as wholly invented scholarship, even if scholarship rooted in some common theories and ideas, but correct me if I'm wrong. But then two, some of the ways that this world deviates from ours. I mean, obviously the Faeries scholarship in and of itself, but here in this book, we're in this kind of very remote place, so we're not seeing the wider world. And I think that that makes a lot of sense for kind of being introduced, especially to these characters for the first time. But I do anticipate getting to see a little bit more of the world in upcoming books, so I will be interested to see how that plays out. But ultimately, I think this was a lot of fun, if not perfect, and I think that it fits a narrative void while feeling both familiar and new. So I will be very interested to see how this series continues to develop. If you read this, I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts, or even just kind of what stories about the Fae you are most attracted to, if you're even attracted to them at all. But thanks for hanging out and listening to my thoughts. Read something good, like and subscribe if you feel like it, and yeah,